January 1945. Somewhere along the American Gulf Coast, the air tastes of salt and diesel. A cold wind comes off the water and combs through rows of tar paper barracks and chain-link fencing. Beyond the wire, a distant engine note swells steady, confident until it becomes a physical thing you can feel in your ribs. Then the shape appears, an aircraft cutting low across a pale winter sky, silver skin flashing as it banks. The sound rolling over the camp like a door being thrown open. Inside the fence, a column of German women auxiliaries, clerks, signals personnel, nurses, women in uniform without rifles, pause in mid-step. Their eyes follow the plane and then, just as striking as the aircraft itself, they see the pilot on the ground afterward, a woman, moving with purpose, wearing a flight suit that looks like an American answer to gravity. Not costume, not propaganda. Cloth, zipper, insignia, and the hard-earned posture of someone trained to take machinery into the air and bring it back alive. For many of the women behind that wire, the war had already become a procession of collapsed certainties, bombed cities, broken rail lines, hunger measured in slices of bread, and the long retreat of official promises. But this moment, this single image of a woman in a flight suit lands with a different force. Because it is not only about aviation, it is about what a society chooses to permit and what it chooses to forbid. And it matters precisely because it is so quiet. The Second World War is often told in thunder-armored columns, burning cities, mass graves, oceans of steel. Yet some of the most decisive shocks happened far from the front, in places where the weapons were absent and the comparisons were unavoidable. The United States held hundreds of thousands of Axis prisoners of war in camps spread across the country, hundreds of installations in dozens of states under the obligations of the 1929 Geneva Convention, with the Red Cross involved in inspections and communications. In those camps, the war continued in a different form. A contest of systems conducted through food, routine, labor pay, mail delivery, libraries, and the daily visibility of American life just beyond the wire. The camps became, unintentionally and sometimes deliberately, classrooms in political reality. For German female prisoners, the shock was sharpened by timing. They arrived late in the war's arc, when Germany's material situation had become catastrophic. By 1944 and 1945, many German civilians, especially in cities, were living amid rubble and rationing so severe that the idea of abundance felt like a rumor from another planet. The Reich's propaganda had long insisted that America was decadent, undisciplined, racially mixed, politically chaotic, rich, perhaps, but soft. Germany would not simply defeat its enemies, it claimed. It would outlast them. In that story, the American home front was a weak seam waiting to split. A prisoners' camp in the United States threatened that story by existing at all. Because the camps were not only fences and guard towers, they were organized kitchens, medical care, scheduled work details, and most unsettling to prisoners raised on total war narratives, predictability. Some camps, such as Camp Ruston in Louisiana, held thousands of prisoners and were designed with standardized facilities, barracks, mess halls, chapels, wells, recreation space, and the bureaucratic machinery of a nation that could build entire functioning towns for men who had been trying to kill Americans months earlier. Camp Ruston, activated on Christmas Day 1942, held German prisoners beginning in 1943, reaching a peak of 40,315 prisoners in October 1943. It also provided canteens where POWs could buy items like coffee and cigarettes using camp script. Even the geography itself carried symbolism. Camp Ruston was first used as a training center for the 5th Women's Army Auxiliary Corps before the prisoners arrived, an American women's military organization preparing for wartime service on the same ground that would soon hold captured German soldiers. The land did not belong exclusively to men, and it did not belong exclusively to captives. It belonged to a state that organized labor and logistics at scale, but the moment with the woman pilot this was a different kind of contradiction. In the Germany these prisoners had known, women had been mobilized for the war effort in enormous numbers: industry, agriculture, clerical work, anti-aircraft auxiliaries, signals, nursing, evacuation administration. Nazi ideology praised women as essential, but within boundaries: mother, worker, supporter, rarely autonomous professional warrior, and almost never framed as an equal partner in elite technical roles. The regime's gender mythology was rigid even when reality demanded flexibility. America's mythology was different. It was not pure. It was not consistent. It carried its own exclusions and hypocrisies. But it had a peculiar elasticity in wartime, the ability to improvise new roles when necessity demanded it, and then to fight internally about whether those roles should remain. That is why the flight suit matters. Because to a German prisoner in 1945, a woman wearing it was not simply an individual. She was evidence. The United States had created the Women Airforce Service Pilots WASP, ASP, an organization formed by merging earlier women's pilot programs in 1943. These women were civilians, not granted full military status at the time, yet they flew the aircraft of a global war, ferrying, testing, towing targets, transporting personnel, moving machines from factory to field. Nearly 1,100 highly trained women flew and ferried 12,650 aircraft over more than 60 million miles. It is a number that reads like a ledger entry until you picture what it means. Weather, fatigue, mechanical failure, unfamiliar aircraft, the constant margin where a mistake becomes a crater. Many of the German women behind the wire had been taught to imagine American women as either frivolous ornaments of a decaying society or desperate laborers filling in for absent men. The flight suit shattered both caricatures. The suit was functional. It was designed for wind and oral and altitude. It carried the shape of competence. It was a uniform that said, "This body belongs in the sky, and the nation has authorized it." For some prisoners, the first shock of America was always food, meat, fruit, bread that did not arrive like a ration but like a normal thing. In Louisiana camps, prisoners could purchase coffee and cigarettes with scrip. In many POW memoirs and oral histories across the United States, the remembered abundance was not always luxury. It was regularity. Meals that came every day. Soap. Medical attention, the ability to write home. Even boredom, that strange privilege of being alive long enough to be bored. But food alone could be explained away. A prisoner could tell herself, "They are rich now, but decadent. They feed us because they fear us. They feed us because they are naive." A regime can tolerate the enemy's bread. It is harder to tolerate the enemy's symbols. And the flight suit, as it moved across the airfield, became a symbol that returned again and again in the prisoners' minds. Not as fashion, as proof of an idea, that a democracy at war could still rearrange its own social rules, sometimes grudgingly, sometimes imperfectly in order to win, and that it could do so without collapsing into disorder. The German women had expectations when they entered captivity. Some expected humiliation. Others expected revenge. Some expected, after years of propaganda about Allied brutality, that they would be treated as a contaminated enemy, class-stripped, punished, starved, used. Others expected condescension, the kind that turns a human being into a lesson. What they encountered often was procedure. The camps were not paradises. They were prisons. There were fences and towers, searches and regulations. There were tensions, ideological hardliners among prisoners, conflicts between Nazis and non-Nazis, rumors, punishments, loneliness, the slow grind of waiting for a war to end while your homeland collapses in your imagination. But the administration of these camps operated within a legal framework that the United States publicly claimed to respect. In some places, guards struggled to manage fraternization risks, and local communities sometimes worried about prisoners' presence. Yet the overall system functioned as a mass holding operation without devolving into the kind of organized starvation and degradation that had become normal in much of Europe by 1945. Now add the aircraft. Add the sound of an engine that is not scavenged, not patched together from scrap, not rationed into silence. Add the sight of aviation fuel being spent without ceremony. Add the casual confidence of a country that can afford to fly training hours, ferry flights, test hops, because the supply chain behind that flight is intact. Add the woman in the suit stepping down from the cockpit ladder like she belongs to the future. This is where the emotional contrast becomes sharpest, because the German women had also served division. Many had joined auxiliaries believing in competence, national rebirth, order, a disciplined society led by men who claimed to have mastered history. Some believed deeply. Others believed because belief was safer than doubt. Some believed because Germany, after the humiliation and chaos following the First World War, had offered them structure and purpose. Even those who did not love the ideology often clung to its promise that sacrifice would be rewarded, that the enemy would collapse first, that the Reich's rigid hierarchy was strength, and captivity, Hierarchy did not disappear, it was simply replaced. The women behind the wire were no longer part of a rising empire. They were part of an administrative problem handled by clerks with forms, by guards with schedules, by cooks with menus. They were processed, counted, issued rules. They were kept alive by the enemy system. And then, on the other side of the fence, they saw an American woman in a flight suit. Not a nurse, not a typist, not a factory worker at the edge of the story. A pilot, a member of the aviation world the total war had made sacred. In the German imagination, aviation had been a cathedral of national pride. Luftwaffe aces, sleek machines, the romance of the sky. Even late in the war, as Germany's air power collapsed under Allied pressure, the mythology of flight remained potent. Now that mythology was being literally worn by the enemy's women. Historically, we can anchor this in what the Devil's program was and what it achieved. The program's roots lay in 1942, when Army Air Forces leadership authorized women to fill ferrying and related roles amid pilot shortages. By July and August 1943, the major women's pilot organizations were consolidated into WASP. Women trained at Avenger Field in Sweetwater, Texas under an Army Way regimen, then served across the country at dozens of bases. 38 WASPs died in service. They were civilians, and families often bore burial costs. The program ended in December 1944, and their records were later sealed. Veteran status came only decades afterward. Even in official summaries, the contradiction is plain. They were praised, then disbanded, then forgotten, then rediscovered. That contradiction is important because it deepens the symbolic power of the flight suit. It was not the uniform of a fully accepted warrior class. It was, in many ways, an argument stitched into fabric, proof that women could do the work, even when the institution refused to fully acknowledge them. For German prisoners, that kind of ambiguity achievement without full ideological proclamation could be difficult to interpret. Totalitarian systems tend to make everything declarative. They do not like quiet evidence. They prefer banners, slogans, and marching lines. America's evidence was often incidental. A woman pilot walking across an airfield because she had a job to do, and the job was real. The documented record states that WASPs ferried aircraft and flew a wide range of types, logging immense mileage across domestic routes. Smithsonian Air and Space archival features preserve images and original captions of WASPs with aircraft such as P-51s and P-38s, underscoring that these were not symbolic flights and harmless trainers alone. The historical photographic archive exists because the work existed. At this point, the story becomes less about what the prisoners saw and more about what the site did to them. War is not only fought with bullets, it is fought with comparisons. Every prisoner is a forced observer, condemned to watch the enemy's routine and measure it against what they were taught. The German women had been told that Americans were undisciplined, that democracy was an inefficient spectacle, that a nation run by elections would not endure the strain of total war. Yet the United States had built an industrial engine that could feed its armies, supply its allies, and still allocate enough material to house and manage hundreds of thousands of enemy captives. The camp itself, organized, supplied, functioning, was already an argument. Then the aircraft engine note returned again and again like a drumbeat. In this script, the recurring object is the flight suit. It is not just clothing. It is the visible wrapper of American abundance. The res to train a pilot, to tailor specialized gear, to fuel aircraft for ferrying missions. It is also the visible wrapper of American democracy. A society that, under stress, expands roles in ways that authoritarian ideology insists are impossible or corrupt. Each time the German women see that suit on a runway, in a photograph on a notice board, in the passing presence of an American airfield worker, they are forced to confront the question the Reich tried to answer in advance: who is permitted to be capable? In Nazi ideology, capability was often framed as a property of race and male authority, with women essential but subordinate, celebrated but confined. In the American wartime reality, capability was treated more pragmatically, still constrained by prejudice and politics, but elastic where necessity demanded. The WASP story itself shows that elasticity was contested and incomplete, but real enough to put women in cockpits of military aircraft. For prisoners, the psychological shift does not happen in a single epiphany. It happens in increments. It happens in the way guards follow rules, in the way mail arrives, in the way food is served on schedule, in the way a camp canteen sells coffee and cigarettes through a controlled system of script. in the way local towns exist around the camp without collapsing into panic, in the way a nation can afford to be procedural, and then in the way a woman in a flight suit walks as if the sky is part of her assigned territory. Transformation in this story is not conversion into admiration. It is something more complex and historically plausible, a cracking of certainty. For some German prisoners, men and women alike, captivity in the United States created cognitive dissonance that later influenced post-war attitudes. Camp Rustin's historical account explicitly notes that decades after incarceration, former POWs commonly remarked that their experiences led them to support a post-war democratic government in their own countries. That is not a claim of instant enlightenment. It is a statement about long-term influence, the slow reshaping of belief through exposure to a functioning alternative. For German women prisoners, the exposure carried an added layer: gender. The Reich had asked them to sacrifice for a system that insisted on male primacy even as it consumed male lives at an industrial pace. In America, they saw women mobilized into uniformed auxiliaries, factory lines, administrative roles, and, in rare but symbolically potent cases, into flight. They could tell themselves it was unnatural. They could tell themselves it was a stunt. But the suit, the aircraft, the procedures, the infrastructure, these were not theater props. They were parts of a machine that was winning. A final truth settles in a camp like sediment. Not every victory is won on the battlefield. Some are won in the mind, when an enemy realizes they have been lied to, not only about the other side, but about themselves. In the closing days of the war, many German prisoners faced an unbearable uncertainty. What waited at home? Some had families in cities reduced to ash. Some had no homes at all. Some feared Soviet occupation. Some feared retribution. Some feared shame. Some feared the moral collapse of the world they had served. The war had hollowed out the future, and captivity suspended them above it like people standing on thin ice. In that suspended time, symbols grow heavy. The flight suit becomes one of those symbols, not of American perfection, but of American capacity. It is a garment that implies choice, the choice to train, the choice to assign, the choice to trust. In a dictatorship, trust is vertical. It is granted downward in narrow channels. In a democracy at war, trust can be messy, argued over, unevenly distributed, but when it appears, it can be revolutionary. And so, in the epilogue, we return to the first sound. An engine overhead is not democracy in itself. An airplane is not freedom by definition. Technology can serve any master, but in the winter air above that POW camp, the sound carried a meaning that propaganda could not fully erase, that the enemy's society was not collapsing, not starving, not unraveling into chaos. It was building, flying, adapting, and when the German women saw a woman in a flight suit zipper caught in the light, fabric creased from use, they were not only seeing an American pilot, they were seeing a country rich enough to spend fuel on training, organized enough to follow rules even with enemies, and flexible enough to let a woman wear the sky as her workplace. Behind barbed wire, that sight did what bombs and speeches often fail to do. It made an ideology look small. Because the deepest threat to any totalitarian promise is not defeat alone. It is the discovery that the world is wider than the story you are given, and that ordinary people, even women in plain cloth suits, can move through that wider world with agency. In the end, freedom is not always announced with flags. Sometimes it arrives as a sound over a winter camping engine note, steady as a heartbeat, followed by the quiet, undeniable figure of a woman who has been allowed to fly.